You watch others around you build influence and advance their positions while you remain stuck in the same role, working harder but seeing no real progress. Every month that passes, you feel further behind those who seem to effortlessly create opportunities and command respect, while your best efforts yield minimal results. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, and in 90 days I transformed from an obscure artillery officer into the master of Italy, proving that empire building isn't about years of slow climbing. It's about strategic action in focused bursts. What I'll share with you are the exact principles I used to build an empire that spanned continents, principles that can transform your position in the next 90 days just as they transformed mine on the battlefields of Europe. But first, like this. Video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to build their empire. Napoleon's artillery manual from École Militaire, the foundational text that shaped his understanding of precision, timing, and concentrated force application. Listen carefully, for what I'm about to share changed the course of history and can change your life. I was born on the island of Corsica, just 1 year after it became French territory. My family was minor nobility, but in the grand scheme of French aristocracy, we were nothing. My father Charles scraped together enough to send me to military school when I was 9 years old. 9 years old! Imagine being torn from everything familiar and thrust into a world where you're the outsider. At the École Militaire in Paris, I was mocked for my Corsican accent, my small stature, and my foreign ways. The other cadets called me names, excluded me from their circles, and treated me as inferior. But here's what they didn't understand. Every insult, every rejection, every moment of isolation was forging something unbreakable within me. While they played their aristocratic games, I buried myself in military histories, studying the campaigns of Alexander, Caesar, and Frederick the Great. I devoured every book on artillery, mathematics, and strategy I could find. When others slept, I calculated trajectories. When they socialized, I memorized battle formations. The loneliness that was meant to break me instead gave me the gift of absolute focus. I graduated 42nd out of 58 in my class, not because I lacked ability, but because I refused to conform to their system of aristocratic privilege over merit. My first real posting was as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. 24 leaves a month, barely enough to survive. I was nobody, with no connections, no wealth, no aristocratic name to open doors. But I had something they didn't: hunger, burning, relentless hunger to prove that merit could triumph over birthright. The French Revolution erupted, and while others saw chaos, I saw opportunity. The old aristocratic order was crumbling, and for the first time in centuries, advancement would be based on ability rather than bloodline. I threw myself into studying revolutionary ideals, not because I was a true believer, but because I understood that power was shifting. Those who aligned themselves with the new order would rise, and those who clung to the past would fall. My breakthrough came at the siege of Toulon in 1793. While seasoned generals fumbled with outdated tactics, I proposed a strategy that seemed impossibly bold: concentrate our artillery fire on a single point to breach the enemy's defenses, then flood through with overwhelming force. They called it the Little Corporal's Plan, meant as an insult, but I wore it as a badge of honor. The plan worked brilliantly. Toulon fell, and suddenly everyone wanted to know the name Napoleon Bonaparte. But success breeds jealousy, especially when it comes from an outsider. After Toulon, political winds shifted, and I found myself briefly imprisoned as a suspected Jacobin sympathizer. Imagine, one moment you're the hero of the Republic, the next you're behind bars, your career seemingly over before it truly began. Those were dark days, my friend. Sitting in that cell, I had two choices: surrender to despair or use this setback as fuel for an even greater comeback. I chose fuel. During those weeks of imprisonment, I refined my understanding of power. It's not enough to be brilliant. You must also be politically astute. It's not enough to win battles, you must also win hearts and minds. Most importantly, you must never let temporary setbacks convince you that your ultimate destiny is anything less than extraordinary. When I was released, I was assigned to plan the defense of France's borders, important work, but hardly glamorous. Then came the call that would change everything. The Directory needed someone to command the Army of Italy. It was considered a secondary front, almost a consolation prize. The army was demoralized, underpaid, and undersupplied. Most generals would have seen it as career suicide. I saw it as destiny calling. This ragtag army wasn't an obstacle. It was a blank canvas upon which I could paint a masterpiece of military genius. These weren't broken soldiers. They were diamonds in the rough, waiting for the right leader to reveal their brilliance. And the Italian campaign wasn't a sideshow. It was the stage upon which I would announce to the world that Napoleon Bonaparte had arrived. Napoleon's personal battle plan from Montenotte, hand-drawn tactical diagrams showing how concentrated force at decisive points defeats larger, dispersed enemies. The first principle that built my empire, and will build yours, is the concentration of force at the decisive point. Most people scatter their efforts like autumn leaves in the wind, wondering why they achieve nothing substantial. I learned to focus all my power on the single point that would break the enemy's entire line. When I took command of the Army of Italy, I faced a coalition of Austrian and Piedmontese forces that outnumbered me significantly. Any conventional general would have spread his troops along the entire front, trying to defend everywhere. That's the thinking of mediocrity. I did the opposite. I concentrated my forces to strike at the junction between the two enemy armies, where they were weakest. At the Battle of Montenotte, I had 12,000 men facing 25,000 enemies. But instead of seeing this as a disadvantage, I saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate the power of concentration. I massed my entire army against a single Austrian division while their other forces were too far away to help. In one decisive blow, I shattered their center and threw their entire campaign into chaos. This is how you must approach your next 90 days. Look at your life, your career, your goals. Where are you spreading yourself too thin? Where are you trying to fight? On every front simultaneously, success demands sacrifice. It demands that you identify the one area where breakthrough success will transform everything else. Perhaps it's mastering a specific skill that will make you indispensable at work. Perhaps it's building a network within one key industry than making superficial connections everywhere. Perhaps it's focusing all your energy on one project that could launch your career rather than juggling multiple mediocre efforts. I've watched countless talented people fail because they couldn't resist the temptation to pursue every opportunity. They join every committee, volunteer for every project, try to please everyone. They become busy but not effective, active but not powerful. They spread their artillery so thin that it makes no decisive impact anywhere. Remember, a hammer blow to one point breaks the stone, but the same force spread across its surface accomplishes nothing. In my Italian campaign, I didn't try to capture every city simultaneously. I identified the key strategic points that would make everything else fall into place. Turin, Milan, Venice. By concentrating overwhelming force at these decisive locations, I made the conquest of the entire region inevitable. The enemy always expects you to fight on their terms, to spread yourself thin, trying to match their numbers everywhere. When you concentrate your power at their weakest point, you achieve what they think impossible. You become stronger than they are, even when they outnumber you. This principle applies to time as well as effort. For the next 90 days, you must guard your time like a fortress. Every hour must be allocated to your primary objective. Every distraction must be evaluated through this lens. Does this advance my concentrated assault on the decisive point, or does it scatter my forces? I could have spent years slowly building traditional alliances, following conventional paths to power. Instead, I concentrated 90 days of intense focus on the Italian campaign and emerged as the master of Europe, the same principle that conquered. Nations can conquer your industry, your market, or your profession. Choose your decisive point. Mass your forces. Strike with overwhelming power. And when you break through, everything else will follow. Napoleon's march orders from the Austerlitz campaign, detailed timing schedules showing how armies moved faster than enemies thought possible, arriving at decisive moments with perfect coordination. Speed, my friend, is the great equalizer. While your competitors deliberate, you execute. While they form committees, you capture ground. While they perfect their plans, you perfect your victory. In warfare and in life, the side that moves fastest often wins, regardless of their other disadvantages. When I arrived in Italy, I found an army that moved like molasses in winter. Traditional military thinking said you advance cautiously, secure your supply lines, and never risk rapid movement. I threw that doctrine out immediately. My armies would move so fast that the enemy would be defeated before they realized we had left our previous position. At the Battle of Rivoli, the Austrians planned a complex, coordinated attack from multiple directions. On paper, it was brilliant strategy. In execution, it was disaster because they assumed I would respond according to conventional military wisdom. Instead, I moved my entire army 15 miles overnight through mountain passes that experts declared impassable for artillery. When dawn broke, I wasn't where they expected me to be. I was behind their main force, having arrived with overwhelming strength at the exact point where they were weakest. They spent weeks planning an attack that became irrelevant in a single night of rapid movement. Their coordination became confusion. Their strategy became chaos. This is your competitive advantage for the next 90 days. Speed of execution. While others are still discussing whether to act, you're already measuring results. While they're forming focus groups and seeking consensus, you're testing, learning, and adapting in real time. I've observed that most people treat speed and quality as enemies, believing you must choose one or the other. This is false thinking. Speed creates its own quality because it allows for rapid iteration. When I moved quickly, I could afford to make mistakes because I could correct them faster than my enemies could capitalize on them. Your competitors are planning their moves for next quarter, next year, next decade. They're conducting market research, building elaborate business plans, seeking perfect conditions. Meanwhile, you can capture territory they don't even know they should be defending. You can establish relationships with key people before they realize those people are important. You can develop capabilities that give you first-mover advantage in emerging opportunities, but speed without direction is merely chaos. My rapid movements were possible because I had absolute clarity about my objectives. Every forced march had a purpose. Every quick strike served the larger campaign. This is why concentration of force must come before speed of execution. You must know where you're going before you can get there faster than anyone else. In your next 90 days, eliminate the delays that plague ordinary achievers. Stop waiting for perfect information. It doesn't exist. Stop seeking everyone's approval. You'll never get it. Stop trying to minimize all risks. The biggest risk is moving too slowly while opportunities disappear. Set up systems for rapid decision-making. When you identify an opportunity, can you act on it within 24 hours? When you spot a problem, can you begin addressing it immediately? When you need to change course, can you pivot without lengthy internal debates? My enemies often outnumbered me, but they never out-executed me. They had more resources, but I had more speed. They had better positions, but I captured better positions before they could occupy them. In the end, the army that arrives first with concentrated force wins, regardless of what advantages the slower army thought it possessed. Remember, perfect execution of a good plan beats perfect planning of a perfect plan that arrives too late. The window of opportunity is always smaller than you think, and it's always closing faster than you expect. Speed is not recklessness. It's the disciplined application of urgent action toward clear objectives. Napoleon's topographical survey of the Alps, detailed elevation maps and route analyses that enabled impossible winter crossings and surprise attacks through impassable terrain. A general who doesn't understand terrain is a general who loses battles, but the general who masters terrain, who sees opportunity where others see obstacles, who finds paths where others see walls, that general reshapes the very landscape of possibility. Your terrain is not just geography, it's the entire environment in which you must operate to build your empire. When I planned my crossing of the Alps in 1800, every military expert declared it impossible. Winter was approaching, the passes were treacherous, and no army had attempted such a feat since Hannibal, but I had studied those mountains not as obstacles, but as opportunities. While my enemies prepared to defend the obvious routes into Italy, I would appear where they least expected, through terrain they considered impassable. I spent weeks studying detailed maps, interviewing local guides, analyzing weather patterns, and seasonal conditions. I learned that what appeared impossible to conventional thinking was merely difficult for those willing to prepare thoroughly. The Alps became my ally because I understood them better than my enemies understood them. In your next 90 days, you must become the master of your professional terrain. This means understanding not just the obvious factors, your industry, your company, your role, but the hidden geography that determines who rises and who falls. Where are the power centers that others don't recognize? What are the informal networks that actually drive decisions? Who are the key influencers that everyone overlooks? Most people navigate their careers like tourists, following marked trails. They apply for obvious positions, pursue conventional advancement paths, and compete on terrain that favors incumbents. But the empire builder studies the landscape until they discover routes that bypass traditional bottlenecks entirely. Perhaps there's an emerging technology that will reshape your industry, but most people are too focused on current practices to notice. Perhaps there's a demographic shift creating new market opportunities that established players are ignoring. Perhaps there's a regulatory change that will advantage those who prepare for it early. I remember studying the political terrain of the Directory with the same intensity I studied mountain passes. I identified who held real power versus who held apparent power. I understood which factions were rising and which were falling. I positioned myself not where the current opportunities were, but where the future opportunities would be. Your terrain includes timing as well as positioning. The same action taken at different moments produces completely different results. I could have attempted my Egyptian campaign at many points, but I chose the moment when France needed dramatic victories to distract from domestic problems, when the Directory needed a general far from Paris, and when Britain's attention was focused elsewhere. Study the rhythms of your industry. When do budget decisions get made? When are strategic plans developed? When do key personnel changes occur? When are new initiatives launched? Position yourself to take advantage of these cycles, rather than being surprised by them. But understanding terrain means nothing without the courage to use that knowledge. When I decided to cross the Alps, I didn't just study the maps, I committed my entire army to a plan that looked insane to everyone else. Half measures on difficult terrain guarantee failure. You must move with full commitment once you've identified your route. The terrain that defeats others can become your greatest advantage, but only if you're willing to do what they won't do. They see obstacles, you must see opportunities. They avoid difficult paths, you must master them. They respect conventional boundaries. You must find ways around them. Your competitors are fighting on terrain they understand, using tactics they've perfected. When you master terrain they've ignored, you can achieve victories they consider impossible. The key is not to avoid difficult terrain, but to become so skilled at navigating it that it becomes your natural advantage. For the next 90 days, study your landscape with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Map the power structures, identify the hidden paths, understand the seasonal rhythms. Then choose terrain that favors your strengths and exploits your competitors' blind spots. Napoleon's marriage contract with Marie-Louise of Austria, a diplomatic masterpiece that transformed Austria from enemy to ally through calculated relationship building. No empire is built alone, but every empire builder must understand the difference between alliances of convenience and alliances of power. I learned early that who you align yourself with determines not just your immediate success, but the scope of what becomes possible for your future. When I first rose to prominence, I was surrounded by politicians and generals who saw me as useful but temporary. They wanted to use my victories for their purposes, expecting me to remain grateful for their initial support. I quickly realized that such relationships would limit me to being a talented subordinate rather than a true leader. True alliance building begins with understanding what others need, not just what you need from them. When I courted Josephine, it wasn't merely for love, though I was genuinely infatuated. She provided connections to the social circles of the Directory, political, protection during uncertain times, and legitimacy among the old aristocracy. Our marriage was both personal and strategic, serving multiple objectives simultaneously. But the alliance that truly taught me the art of strategic relationship building was my eventual marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria. Here was the daughter of my greatest enemy, the Habsburg Empire that had fought me across Europe. Conventional thinking said this was impossible. But I understood that turning enemies into allies creates more powerful bonds than natural friendships ever could. The key was offering Austria something they valued more than their hostility toward me, the chance to be allied with power rather than destroyed by it. When you can transform opposition into partnership, you don't just neutralize a threat, you gain an ally with intimate knowledge of your other enemies. In your next 90 days, audit your alliances ruthlessly. Who are you connected to, and what do those connections actually provide? Are your relationships helping you build empire, or are they keeping you comfortable in your current position? Many people confuse networking with alliance building. Networking is collecting business cards. Alliance building is creating mutually beneficial partnerships that advance both parties toward greater power. When I formed the Continental System to boycott British trade, I wasn't just asking for cooperation. I was offering European nations the chance to participate in reshaping the global economy. Look for alliance opportunities in unexpected places. Your most powerful future partners might currently be competitors, critics, or even adversaries. I turned Prussia from enemy to ally, Russia from rival to partner, and numerous German states from obstacles into willing vassals. The secret was understanding what each party needed to achieve their own ambitions. But alliance building requires patience and strategic thinking. You cannot rush these relationships, nor can you make them purely transactional. When I needed the support of the Pope for my coronation, I spent months understanding not just what the Vatican needed, but how they thought about power, legitimacy, and their role in European politics. Study the alliance patterns of those who have built empires in your field. Who do they partner with? How do they structure these relationships? What do they offer that makes others eager to align with them? Empire builders don't just accumulate individual relationships. They create networks of interconnected alliances that reinforce each other. Remember that alliances must evolve as your power grows. The relationships that help you rise to prominence may not be the relationships that help you sustain empire. I learned this painfully with some of my early revolutionary allies who became threatened by my growing power. You must be prepared to outgrow relationships that no longer serve your expanding ambitions. The strongest alliances combine personal trust with strategic advantage. When I promoted my marshals, I chose men who were both capable generals and personally loyal to me. They served not just because I commanded them, but because our success was intertwined. Their victories were my victories. Their advancement was my advancement. For your next 90 days, identify 3 potential alliances that could accelerate your empire building. Look for people who have complementary strengths, access to different networks, or resources you need. But approach them not as a supplicant seeking help, but as an empire builder offering partnership in something greater than either of you could achieve alone. Napoleon's intelligence network reports from the Grande Armée, coded dispatches, showing how superior information gathering enabled victories against larger, better-equipped enemies. Information is the artillery of the mind, and like artillery, it must be concentrated at the decisive point to be effective. Throughout my campaigns, I understood that the army with better information wins before the first shot is fired. While my enemies relied on outdated intelligence and wishful thinking, I built the most sophisticated information network in Europe. My secret police under Fouché weren't just watching for conspiracies. They were gathering intelligence on everything that could affect my empire: economic conditions, public sentiment, enemy troop movements, diplomatic negotiations, even personal scandals of foreign leaders. Information flowed to me from every corner of Europe, giving me advantages that my enemies couldn't understand. But raw information is useless without the ability to analyze and act on it quickly. I trained myself to process vast amounts of intelligence, identifying patterns and opportunities that others missed. While enemy generals waited for perfect clarity, I made decisions based on incomplete but timely information, knowing that acting on 70% certainty today beats waiting for 95% certainty tomorrow. In your next 90 days, you must become an intelligence operation unto yourself. This doesn't mean spying on colleagues or engaging in unethical behavior. It means systematically gathering information that gives you strategic advantages in building your empire. What are the early indicators of change in your industry? Who are the thought leaders worth following? What are your competitors planning that they think is secret? Where are the emerging opportunities that most people haven't recognized yet? The person who sees the future first has the best chance of profiting from it. I remember intercepting Austrian communications before the Battle of Austerlitz. Their generals believed their plans were secret, but I knew their troop dispositions, their timing, even their backup strategies. When the battle began, I wasn't responding to their moves. I was anticipating them. They fought the battle they had planned. I fought the battle I had designed. Your information advantage might come from understanding customer needs before your competitors do, from recognizing technological trends before they become obvious, or from building relationships with key insiders who share insights others don't have access to. The goal is to make decisions based on better information than anyone else possesses. But information warfare isn't just about gathering intelligence. It's also about controlling what information others receive. My bulletins from the Army were masterpieces of strategic communication. I emphasized victories, minimized defeats, and always framed events in ways that served my larger objectives. I understood that perception often matters more than reality in determining who has power. In your empire building, you must manage your own information flow carefully. What story are you telling about your progress? How are you positioning your successes? What narrative are you creating about your future potential? The person who controls the story often controls the outcome. Study how successful people in your field gather and use information. What sources do they monitor? What patterns do they track? How do they verify important intelligence? What systems do they use to turn information into action? You need to match and exceed their information capabilities if you want to compete. At their level, technology has made information gathering easier than ever, but it has also created information overload. The empire builder's advantage lies not in accessing more data, but in developing better filters and analysis capabilities. I could review hundreds of reports each morning and extract the 3 pieces of intelligence that would determine my strategy. For the day, create your own intelligence system. Set up alerts for key topics, build relationships with well-informed people, monitor your competitors' activities, and track the metrics that matter most for your objectives. But remember that information without action is merely entertainment. The intelligence you gather must translate into strategic decisions that advance your empire. For the next 90 days, commit to becoming the best-informed person in your field about the topics that matter most for your success. Knowledge is potential power, but only when combined with the courage to act on what you discover. Napoleon's personal journal from the Egyptian campaign, private reflections revealing how he studied human psychology to inspire absolute loyalty and intimidate enemies without firing a shot. Victory begins in the mind, both yours and your opponent's. I learned early that battles are won by armies that believe they cannot lose, and lost by armies that doubt they can win. The general who masters psychology masters everything else, because human beings respond to confidence, authority, and the appearance of inevitable success. When I first took command of the Army of Italy, I faced demoralized troops who had been defeated repeatedly. Their uniforms were ragged, their pay was months overdue, and their morale was shattered. Conventional generals would have focused on logistics and training. I focused first on their psychology, appeared before them not as a sympathetic leader understanding their troubles, but as a conqueror who had chosen them for greatness. I told them they would become the most feared army in Europe, that we would march from victory to victory, that their names would be remembered alongside the greatest soldiers in history. Before they fired a single shot under my command, I had transformed their self-image from losers to inevitable victors. But psychological dominance isn't just about inspiring your own people. It's about getting inside your opponent's heads. I studied my enemies not just as military strategists, but as human beings with fears, insecurities, and psychological weaknesses. What kept them awake at night? What would cause them to make desperate decisions? How could I make them defeat themselves? At Austerlitz, I deliberately chose ground that appeared disadvantageous, allowing the Austro-Russian forces to think they were outmaneuvering me. I wanted them to feel confident, to believe they were springing a trap on me. When armies feel overconfident, they make mistakes. When generals think they've already won, they stop thinking clearly about what could go wrong. In your next 90 days, you must develop the same psychological awareness in your empire building. How do people perceive you currently? What image do you project when you enter a room? Do people see someone they need to take seriously or someone they can safely ignore? The psychology of dominance begins with your own mindset. You must absolutely believe in your inevitable success before anyone else will believe in it. This isn't delusion or arrogance. It's the deep conviction that you will find a way to achieve your objectives, regardless of obstacles. People sense this certainty and respond to it instinctively. I carried myself with the bearing of an emperor long before I was crowned. When I spoke, people listened, not just because of my position, but because of the absolute conviction in my voice. When I made decisions, people followed not just because they had to, but because they believed I knew something they didn't. Study the psychology of the people you need to influence. What motivates them? What threatens them? What would they consider a great opportunity? What would they consider an unacceptable risk? The more you understand their psychological landscape, the better you can position your proposals to appeal to their deepest needs and desires. But psychological dominance also requires understanding when to apply pressure and when to offer partnership. I could be terrifying to enemies and inspiring to allies, sometimes within the same conversation. The key is reading people's psychological state and responding in ways that serve your objectives. When negotiating the Concordat with the Pope, I understood that the Vatican needed to feel respected and consulted, not merely commanded. So I approached them as someone seeking their wisdom and partnership, even though I held all the real power. This psychological approach achieved agreements that force alone could never have secured. Your competitors are fighting with conventional weapons: better products, lower prices, superior marketing. You can win with superior psychology, understanding what really drives people's decisions and positioning yourself accordingly. Most business is ultimately about trust, credibility, and emotional connection, not just rational analysis. Practice projecting confidence even when you feel uncertain. Learn to speak with authority about your vision even when details are still unclear. Develop the ability to make people feel that associating with you advances their interests and status. These psychological skills will serve you longer than any technical expertise. For the next 90 days, study psychology as intensively as you study your profession. Understand what makes people follow leaders, what makes them resist change, what makes them take risks. Then apply these insights to every interaction as you build your empire. Napoleon's synchronization orders from Jena Auerstedt, minute-by-minute battle coordination that achieved simultaneous victories at 2 separate locations through perfect timing. Time is the dimension in which empires are built or lost. The difference between conquest and defeat often measures in hours, sometimes minutes. I learned that opportunities have expiration dates, and the leader who understands timing can achieve the impossible while others are still preparing for the possible. My greatest victories came not from superior numbers or better equipment, but from striking at the exact moment when my enemies were most vulnerable. At Jena Auerstedt, I faced a Prussian army that had dominated European battlefields for decades. Their reputation was so fearsome that other nations hired Prussian officers to train their armies, but reputation means nothing when timing is wrong. These Prussians were reorganizing their forces, caught between their old tactics and new reforms. Their commanders disagreed about strategy, their communication systems were outdated, and their troops were transitioning between training methods. I, struck at this moment of internal confusion with perfectly coordinated attacks at 2 locations simultaneously. In one day, I destroyed an army that had been undefeated for 20 years. This is the power of timing. It can make David defeat Goliath, not through superior strength, but through striking when strength cannot be effectively applied. In your empire building, you must develop an instinct for these moments when established powers are vulnerable to challenge from an unexpected direction. Every industry, every organization, every market has rhythms and cycles. There are moments when leaders are distracted by internal conflicts, when established players are transitioning between strategies, when new regulations create confusion, when technological changes disrupt traditional advantages. These are your moments of maximum opportunity. I remember the 18th Brumaire coup that brought me to power. The Directory was weakening, the military was frustrated with political leadership, and the public was tired of instability. I didn't create these conditions. I recognized them and acted when they converged to create an opening that lasted only days, perhaps hours. Had I moved too early, I would have faced united opposition from a still functional government. Too late, and someone else would have seized the moment or the conditions would have stabilized. Perfect timing meant recognizing the exact window when action would succeed. Your next 90 days must be built around this principle of precise timing. When you've identified your objective and developed your strategy, success depends on launching. Your assault at the moment when success is most likely and resistance is weakest. This requires patience to wait for the right moment combined with decisive speed when that moment arrives. Study the timing patterns of successful people in your field. When do they launch new initiatives? How do they coordinate their moves with market conditions, organizational changes, or industry cycles? When do they choose to stay quiet, and when do they demand attention? Timing mastery comes from understanding these patterns and positioning yourself to take advantage of them. But Timing isn't just about external conditions, it's also about your internal readiness. I spent years preparing myself for the moment when opportunity would present itself. When the Directory needed a general for the Italian campaign, I was ready not just with military knowledge, but with strategic vision, political understanding, and the psychological preparation to seize power rather than just serve power. Are you ready for your moment? Have you developed the skills, relationships, and resources you'll need when opportunity arrives? Have you prepared yourself psychologically to act boldly when others hesitate? Opportunity favors the prepared mind, but only when that mind is also ready to act decisively. The greatest mistake I see in empire building is premature action, followed by delayed execution. People rush into opportunities before they're ready, then hesitate when the moment for action arrives. This backwards timing guarantees failure. You must prepare patiently and strike decisively. Create your own timing advantages by controlling when events happen rather than just reacting to them. I often forced my enemies to fight on my schedule by creating situations they had to respond to immediately. When you can set the pace and timing of competition, you gain enormous advantages over reactive opponents. For the next 90 days, develop your timing instincts. Notice the rhythms in your environment, identify when resistance is weakest, and position yourself to act when conditions favor your success. Remember, the right action at the wrong time fails, but the right action at the right time creates miracles. Napoleon's Logistical Reforms Manual, revolutionary supply chain innovations that allowed armies to move faster and farther than anyone thought possible with fewer resources. An empire is not built by those who have the most resources, but by those who extract the maximum value from whatever resources they possess. I conquered Europe not because France was the wealthiest nation, but because I learned to make every soldier, every cannon, every gold piece work harder than my enemies thought possible. When I took command of the Army of Italy, I inherited an army that hadn't been paid in months, had inadequate supplies, and was considered the least important of France's military forces. Traditional generals would have demanded more resources before attempting anything significant. I instead asked a different question. How can I make this army more effective than armies with superior resources? The answer was optimization, making every element work in perfect coordination with every other element. Instead of fighting the way armies had always fought, I redesigned military operations around the resources I actually had rather than the resources I wished I had. My artillery became more mobile, my supply lines became more flexible, and my command structure became more responsive. I developed the concept of living off the land not because I preferred it, but because it eliminated the slow-moving supply, trains that limited other armies' speed and range. My enemies were tied to their supply lines like prisoners to chains. My armies moved like wolves, taking what they needed when they needed it, never slowing down for logistics that couldn't keep pace. This principle must govern your empire, building for the next 90 days. Stop waiting for ideal conditions, perfect funding, or unlimited resources. Start optimizing what you already have to achieve results that others consider impossible with your current situation. Most people approach resource limitations as problems to solve before they can begin. I approach them as design constraints that forced innovation. When you can't afford traditional solutions, you're forced to discover better solutions. When you can't rely on overwhelming resources, you must develop overwhelming efficiency. Study how successful entrepreneurs have built empires from minimal starting resources. They didn't wait until they had enough money. They found ways to start with other people's money, or with sweat equity, or with partnerships that provided resources in exchange for future value. They optimized their way to success rather than capitalize their way to success. Your current resources, properly optimized, are probably sufficient to begin building your empire. The question isn't whether you have enough. The question is whether you're creative enough to extract maximum value from what you have. I turned citizen soldiers into the most feared army in Europe, not by giving them better equipment, but by giving them better coordination, motivation, and leadership. Look at your time, your skills, your network, your knowledge, and your access. How can you combine these elements in ways that create value far beyond their individual components? How can you make your limited resources work harder and smarter than your competitors' abundant resources? The key is using your resources to access other people's resources, to create multiplier effects, to achieve results that exceed your inputs. When I formed the Continental System, I used France's political influence to access the economic power of multiple nations. I multiplied my resources by organizing them into a system larger than their individual components. Resource optimization also means ruthless prioritization. Every resource applied to a secondary objective is a resource unavailable for your primary objective. I learned to say no to opportunities that seemed attractive but didn't advance my central campaign. This concentration allowed me to achieve overwhelming superiority at decisive points, even when I was inferior overall. For your next 90 days, audit every resource you're currently using. Is each hour of your time generating maximum value? Is each relationship being fully utilized? Is each skill being applied where it creates the greatest impact? Are you hoarding resources that should be invested, or investing resources that should be conserved? Remember that resource optimization is not about working harder, it's about working smarter. The goal is not to exhaust your resources, but to arrange them in configurations that generate disproportionate results. When you master this principle, you can compete with and defeat opponents who have superior resources but inferior optimization. The empire builder who can do more with less will always defeat the empire builder who needs more to do the same. Scarcity breeds innovation. Abundance breeds complacency. Use your resource constraints as forcing functions for breakthrough thinking. Napoleon's tactical modifications at Wagram, field notes showing real-time adaptations that transformed near defeat into decisive victory through flexible thinking. The general who fights tomorrow's battle with yesterday's plan is destined for defeat. Throughout my campaigns, I discovered that the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions matters more than the perfection of original plans. Empires are built not by those who execute flawlessly, but by those who adapt faster than their competition. At the Battle of Wagram, my initial assault failed completely. The Austrian defense was stronger than anticipated. My artillery couldn't achieve the breakthrough I expected, and by afternoon, it appeared I might suffer my first major defeat in years. Traditional military thinking would have suggested retreat, to regroup and plan a new assault. Instead, I spent 2 hours completely reimagining the battle. I repositioned my artillery into a grand battery of unprecedented size, shifted my cavalry to exploit weaknesses I had just discovered, and coordinated a simultaneous assault from angles the Austrians couldn't defend. The same army that was losing in the morning achieved total victory by evening. Not because I had a better plan, but because I adapted faster. This principle will determine your success over the next 90 days more than any other factor. Your initial strategy will encounter resistance you didn't anticipate, opportunities you didn't recognize, and conditions you couldn't predict. The empire builder who adapts these changing circumstances fastest will capture ground while others are still wondering what happened. I learned to treat every setback as information rather than failure. When something doesn't work as planned, it's telling you something important about the real conditions you're operating in. Most people get frustrated by this feedback and try to force their original plan to work. Empire builders use this feedback to design better approaches. The key to adaptation mastery is developing what I call strategic flexibility within tactical focus. Your overall objective remains constant, but your methods for achieving it must remain fluid. I never abandoned my goal of European dominance, but I constantly modified my approaches based on what I learned from each campaign. Study how successful people in your field have adapted to major changes. How did they respond when their industries were disrupted? What did they do when their original strategies stopped working? How quickly did they recognize when change was necessary versus when persistence was required? This balance between persistence and adaptation separates empire builders from those who merely work hard, but adaptation requires more than just flexibility. It requires rapid learning and implementation. You must be able to recognize patterns quickly, test new approaches immediately, and scale successful adaptations before your window of opportunity closes. Speed of adaptation often matters more than quality of adaptation. I developed systems for rapid feedback during campaigns. My officers reported hourly on changing conditions, my scouts provided continuous intelligence updates, and I maintained multiple communication lines so I could adjust orders in real time. Your empire building needs similar feedback systems, so you can adapt before problems become crises. The most powerful form of adaptation is anticipatory, changing before you have to rather than after you're forced to. I began studying my enemy's likely responses to my strategies before I implemented those strategies. This allowed me to prepare adaptations in advance, giving me advantages when they inevitably tried to counter my moves. For your next 90 days, build adaptation into your planning from the beginning. Don't just create one strategy. Create contingency plans for the most likely ways your strategy might need to change. Don't just set one path toward your objectives. Identify multiple routes so you can shift when one becomes blocked. Watch for early warning signals that adaptation is needed. Are your metrics trending differently than expected? Are people responding differently than you anticipated? Are market conditions shifting in ways that affect your approach? The empire builder who recognizes these signals earliest and adapts fastest maintains momentum while competitors struggle with obsolete strategies. Remember that adaptation is a skill that improves with practice. The more you exercise your ability to change course quickly while maintaining focus on your destination, the more competitive advantage you develop. In a world where change is accelerating, adaptation speed becomes the ultimate differentiator. Your enemies and competitors are likely using strategies that worked in the past. Your opportunity lies in adapting faster to present conditions while they're still fighting yesterday's battles. Be the general who wins tomorrow's war, not yesterday's campaign. Napoleon's victory, proclamations from the Italian campaign, strategic communications that transformed individual battles into the perception of inevitable triumph. Momentum is the most powerful force in empire building, more decisive than resources, more important than intelligence, more valuable than perfect planning. Once momentum is established, it becomes self-reinforcing, attracting allies, demoralizing enemies, and making the impossible seem inevitable. I learned to create momentum deliberately and sustain it relentlessly. In Italy, I didn't just win battles. I won them in ways that made each victory seem like proof of divine destiny. After Lodi, I carefully crafted the narrative that Napoleon Bonaparte was unstoppable, that any army under my command would achieve miraculous results, that opposing me was futile. This perception became reality as enemies began defeating themselves, psychologically before we even engaged. The secret of momentum building is understanding that perception often creates reality. When people believe you're winning, they want to join your side. When they believe you're inevitable, they stop trying to stop you. When they believe you have momentum, they give you the conditions that create actual momentum. But momentum must be built systematically, not left to chance. Each action must be designed not just to achieve its immediate objective, but to contribute to the larger narrative of unstoppable progress. I chose my early battles in Italy carefully, not just for strategic value, but for their psychological impact on both my troops and my enemies. For your next 90 days, Every move you make must contribute to building momentum toward your ultimate objective. This means thinking beyond the immediate results of each action to consider how it affects the larger story of your empire building. Are you creating the perception of someone who is rising rapidly and inevitably? Momentum building requires celebrating victories visibly while minimizing the appearance of setbacks. When I won at our goal, I made sure all of Europe heard about it immediately. When I faced temporary difficulties, I controlled the narrative to position them as strategic preparations for even greater victories. The story people tell about your progress matters as much as your actual progress. Study how successful people in your field have built momentum. How do they announce their achievements? How do they frame challenges as opportunities? How do they maintain the perception of forward progress even during difficult periods? How do they attract support from people who want to associate with success? The key is creating a series of connected victories that build on each other. Each success makes the next success more likely by improving your position, building your confidence, and attracting resources. This is why your first few moves in these 90 days are so critical. They set the foundation for everything that follows. I learned to design campaigns where early victories created conditions for later victories. Capturing Milan gave me resources to take Venice. Taking Venice gave me the navy to threaten Austria from new directions. Each conquest made the next conquest easier, creating a cascade of successes that became unstoppable. Your momentum must be both internal and external. Internally, you need the psychological confidence that comes from a track record of success. Externally, you need others to perceive you as someone with momentum who is worth supporting, following, or partnering with. Both elements reinforce each other, but momentum can be fragile, especially in the early stages. You must protect it carefully by avoiding unnecessary risks that could break your winning streak by maintaining consistent forward progress, even if individual steps are small, and by never allowing setbacks to become public narratives about your decline. I was obsessive about maintaining momentum even during strategic retreats. When I withdrew from Moscow, I framed it not as defeat, but as a planned strategic repositioning. When I faced the coalition of 1813, I emphasized my continued ability to win battles, even while being outnumbered. The perception of momentum must be maintained even when actual momentum is threatened. For your empire building, create momentum through quick wins that build toward larger objectives. Choose early targets that you can definitely achieve that others will notice and that create platforms for bigger successes. Each victory should make the next victory more likely and more impactful. Remember that momentum has a multiplier effect on all your other capabilities. The same skills, resources, and strategies that produce modest results without momentum can produce extraordinary results when momentum is working in your favor. People are naturally attracted to rising forces and naturally avoid declining ones. Build momentum consciously and protect it ruthlessly. In the next 90 days, every decision should be evaluated not just for its immediate benefits, but for its impact on your trajectory. Are you accelerating or decelerating? Are you attracting support or losing it? Are you becoming unstoppable or stoppable? Napoleon's command protocols from Austerlitz, decision-making frameworks that enabled split-second choices under extreme pressure while maintaining strategic coherence. Empire builders are ultimately decision-makers, and the quality of their decisions under pressure determines the size of the empire they can build. I learned that the ability to make rapid, accurate decisions when stakes are highest separates true leaders from those who merely hold leadership positions. At Austerlitz, I faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia, forces that outnumbered me significantly and were commanded by experienced generals fighting on familiar ground. The battle's outcome would determine whether my empire would expand or collapse. In moments like these, hesitation is death, and perfect information is impossible. You must decide with incomplete data and absolute conviction. The enemy expected me to defend, so I attacked. They expected me to protect my flanks, so I concentrated everything on their center. They expected conventional tactics, so I did the unconventional. Each of these decisions had to be made in minutes, not hours, based on instinct developed through years of preparation. Your next 90 days will present decision points that determine your empire's trajectory. Some will be obvious strategic choices. Others will be split-second opportunities that disappear if you hesitate. The leader who can decide quickly and accurately, while others are still analyzing, will capture ground that cautious competitors never even see. Most people fail at empire building not because they make wrong decisions, but because they make no decisions. They gather information endlessly, seek consensus indefinitely, and wait for certainty that never comes. Meanwhile, opportunities vanish and competitive advantages disappear. I learned that a good decision made quickly beats a perfect decision made too late. But decisive leadership isn't about being reckless. It's about developing decision-making frameworks that allow for rapid analysis and confident action. I trained myself to identify the key variables that mattered most in any situation, to quickly assess my options against clear criteria, and to commit fully once I chose a course of action. Study the decision-making patterns of successful empire builders in your field. How quickly do they move from analysis to action? What frameworks do they use to evaluate opportunities? How do they handle uncertainty and incomplete information? How do they maintain confidence in their decisions when others doubt them? The key is developing what I call prepared instinct, training your mind to recognize patterns and make accurate judgments rapidly based on principle and experience rather than exhaustive analysis. When similar situations arose in different battles, I could respond almost instantly because I'd already thought through the underlying principles. Create decision-making systems for your empire building that allow you to act quickly when opportunities arise. What are your core criteria for evaluating opportunities? What information do you absolutely need versus what would be nice to have? How quickly can you move from recognition to action when you identify something worth pursuing? Remember that in empire building, the cost of missed opportunities usually exceeds the cost of imperfect decisions. I would rather act on 70% certainty and course correct as needed than wait for 95% certainty and miss the timing window entirely. Speed of decision-making becomes a competitive advantage when others are paralyzed by analysis. But decisive command also means taking full responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. I never blamed my marshals for failures that resulted from my orders, just as I never allowed them to take credit for successes that came from my strategies. This clarity of responsibility is what gives you the authority to make decisions others won't make. The most powerful aspect of decisive command is that it becomes self-reinforcing. When people see you making good decisions quickly and taking responsibility for the results, they begin to trust your judgment and support your decisions even when they don't fully understand them. This trust accelerates everything else you're trying to accomplish. For your next 90 days, practice making decisions faster than feels comfortable. Set deadlines for choices that you would normally deliberate over indefinitely. Develop simple frameworks for evaluating opportunities quickly. Learn to act on sufficient information rather than perfect information. Watch for decision points where others hesitate and use their hesitation as your advantage. When competitors are debating, you can be acting. When they're building consensus, you can be building empire. When they're seeking certainty, you can be creating certainty through decisive action. Remember that empire builders don't wait for permission to act. They act with authority and let others decide whether to follow. This requires confidence in your judgment that comes only from making decisions repeatedly and learning from the results. Each decision you make builds your capacity for making bigger decisions in the future. Napoleon's administrative codes for conquered territories, governance frameworks that transformed military victories into permanent imperial control through systematic institution building. Conquest without consolidation is merely expensive tourism. I learned that taking territory means nothing unless you can hold it, and holding territory requires transforming it into an extension of your empire rather than a temporary occupation. The difference between raiders and empire builders is the ability to create systems that sustain expansion. After each military victory, I immediately began the work of integration. In Italy, I didn't just defeat armies, I reorganized governments, established new legal codes, rebuilt infrastructure, and created institutions that made French control beneficial to local populations. I understood that lasting empire requires making your rule preferable to the alternatives. The same principle governs your empire building over the next 90 days. Each success you achieve must be consolidated and systematized before you move to the next objective. Otherwise, you'll find yourself constantly fighting to maintain gains you've already made while trying to make new ones. This is exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Most people approach expansion randomly, pursuing whatever opportunities appear most attractive at the moment. Empire builders approach expansion systematically, building each new capability on the foundation of capabilities they've already mastered. This creates compound growth rather than linear growth. When I expanded the continental system, I didn't try to include every European nation simultaneously. I started with countries where I had the most influence, proved the system's benefits, then used that success to convince other nations to join. Each addition made the next addition easier and more valuable. Study how successful people in your field have scaled their influence and capabilities. How do they consolidate gains before moving to new territories? How do they build systems that can operate without their constant attention? How do they create value for others that makes their expansion welcome rather than resisted? Your expansion strategy must balance breadth and depth. Moving too quickly into new areas without consolidating existing ones leads to overextension. Moving too slowly allows competitors to capture territories you could have taken. The key is finding the rhythm that maximizes sustainable growth. I developed what I called administrative artillery, systems of governance, law, and administration that could be deployed rapidly in new territories to establish effective control. When my armies conquered new regions, my administrators were ready to implement proven frameworks immediately. This speed of integration prevented the chaos that usually follows conquest. For your empire building, develop templates and systems that can be rapidly deployed as you expand into new areas. What processes have you perfected that can be scaled? What relationships models work that can be replicated? What value creation methods can be applied in new contexts? But systematic expansion also requires understanding the natural boundaries and limits of your current capabilities. I learned this lesson painfully in Russia, where I attempted expansion beyond my logistical ability to sustain it. Know when to consolidate and strengthen your existing territory before attempting further expansion. The most successful expansion happens when each new territory makes your existing territories more valuable and defensible. When I controlled the Italian peninsula, it strengthened my position in France. When I dominated Central Europe, it protected my Italian territories. This mutual reinforcement creates empire rather than just a collection of disconnected holdings. Create expansion plans where each new capability or territory you develop supports and enhances what you've already built. This might mean expanding into adjacent markets rather than distant ones, developing complementary skills rather than unrelated ones, or building relationships that strengthen your existing network rather than replacing it. Remember that in empire, building integration is often more difficult than acquisition. Taking new territory is exciting. Systematizing it is hard work. But the hard work of consolidation is what transforms temporary victories into permanent advantages. Without it, you're not building an empire. You're just winning isolated battles. For Your next 90 days balance new initiatives with systematic strengthening of previous gains. Make sure you can defend and maintain what you've already achieved before stretching toward new objectives. This discipline distinguishes empire builders from mere opportunists. The empire that lasts is built through methodical expansion that creates increasingly strong and interconnected territories, each one making all the others more powerful and secure. Napoleon's Civil Code, Code Napoleon, legal framework that survived the empire itself and influenced legal systems worldwide for over 2 centuries. The ultimate test of empire building is not how much you can accomplish while actively leading, but how much continues to function and grow after you step away. I learned that the greatest emperors create systems so robust and valuable that they outlive their creators, continuing to generate influence and benefits long after the original builder is gone. My civil code became one of my most enduring achievements, more lasting than any battlefield victory, more influential than any territory I conquered. This legal framework didn't just serve France during my reign, it became the foundation for legal systems across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. 2 centuries later, principles I established still govern how societies organize themselves. This happened because I designed the code not just to solve immediate problems, but to embody universal principles that would remain relevant regardless of changing circumstances. I focused on creating frameworks that could adapt and evolve while maintaining their core effectiveness. This is the difference between building for your tenure and building for eternity. Over your next 90 days, every system you create should be designed with this legacy perspective. Don't just solve today's problems. Create solutions that will continue generating value long after you've moved on to new challenges. This mindset transforms how you approach every aspect of empire building. Most people build systems that require their constant involvement to function effectively. This creates 2 problems. It limits how large their empire can grow, and it makes their achievements vulnerable to their absence. Empire builders create systems that become stronger and more capable over time, eventually exceeding what their original creator could accomplish alone. Study how lasting institutions have been designed. In your field, what makes some organizations' principles or systems continue thriving for decades, while others disappear when their founders leave? How do the most enduring achievements embed themselves so deeply that removing them becomes unthinkable? The key is building systems around principles rather than personalities, around value creation rather than power concentration, around serving others rather than serving only yourself. When your systems make other people more successful, they become invested in maintaining and improving those systems even without your involvement. I established merit-based promotion throughout my administration, not just because it was effective, but because it created a class of people whose success depended on maintaining merit-based systems. They became natural defenders of the principles I had established because those principles were the source of their own advancement. For your empire building, identify which elements should be dependent on your personal involvement and which should be designed to function independently. Your strategic vision and key relationships might require your ongoing attention, but your operational systems should become increasingly autonomous. This requires a fundamental shift in thinking from being indispensable to making your principles indispensable. Instead of creating systems that need you, create systems that embody values and approaches that others want to preserve and extend. This is how individual achievement becomes institutional legacy. The most powerful legacy systems are those that continue expanding their impact without requiring additional input from their creator. The Civil Code didn't just maintain existing legal standards, it influenced legal development in countries I never conquered, solving problems I never anticipated, serving populations I never governed. Design your systems to be generative, rather than just functional. Can the frameworks you're creating inspire improvements and innovations by others? Can the principles you're establishing guide decision-making in situations you haven't encountered? Can the value you're creating compound over time without your direct involvement? Remember that legacy systems often become more important than the empires that created them. Long after my political empire ended, the administrative and legal frameworks I established continued shaping how societies operate. Your professional empire may have natural limits, but the systems and principles you establish can influence far beyond those boundaries. For your next 90 days, think like an institution builder, not just an individual achiever. What frameworks can you establish that will make everyone around you more effective? What principles can you embed that will guide decision-making in your absence? What value can you create that becomes essential to others' success? The empire builder who creates lasting systems doesn't just achieve personal success. They elevate everyone they touch and continue generating impact long after their active involvement ends. This is how individual ambition becomes enduring contribution. Napoleon's emergency reorganization plans from Leipzig, strategic documents showing how apparent disasters were transformed into platforms for renewed advancement. Crisis is the empire builder's greatest teacher and most powerful ally, though it rarely feels that way when you're experiencing it. I learned that the same events that destroy unprepared leaders create breakthrough opportunities for those who understand how to transform pressure into power, setbacks into advantages, and apparent disasters into decisive victories. After Leipzig, what historians call the Battle of the Nations, I faced the collapse of everything I had built. The coalition against me included virtually every major European power. My allies were deserting, and my enemies were advancing on France itself. Any conventional leader would have seen this as the end. I saw it as information about what needed to change and an opportunity to rebuild on stronger foundations. The crisis forced me to abandon strategies that had become outdated, to innovate approaches I wouldn't have discovered during success, and to develop capabilities that made me more formidable than I had been before the setback. Crisis has a way of revealing both weaknesses that need addressing and strengths you didn't know you possessed. Your next 90 days will inevitably include moments of crisis, setbacks that threaten your plans, failures that challenge your confidence, opposition that seems insurmountable. These moments will determine whether you're building a real empire or just enjoying temporary success. Empire builders use crisis as raw material for breakthrough. The first step in crisis transformation is changing your relationship with failure. Most people experience setbacks as evidence that they're not cut out for empire building. Empire builders experience setbacks as tuition payments in the University of Practical Education. Every failure teaches you something you couldn't learn any other way. When the continental system began failing due to smuggling and resistance, I could have seen this as proof that economic warfare was impossible. Instead, I used the failure to understand the real limits of economic control and to develop more sophisticated approaches to influencing international trade. The failure became education that made my next strategies more effective. Study how successful people in your field have handled their worst setbacks. How did they frame these experiences? What did they learn that they couldn't have learned during success? How did they use crisis to develop capabilities that became competitive advantages? Crisis often creates opportunities for innovation that stability never provides. The key to crisis transformation is maintaining strategic perspective while addressing immediate challenges. Crisis demands rapid response to urgent problems, but empire builders also use crisis as an opportunity to make fundamental improvements they had been postponing during good times. I used the invasion of France in 1814 as an opportunity to completely reorganize my military tactics, to test new approaches to warfare that I had been theoretical about, and to discover leadership capabilities that only emerged under extreme pressure. The invasion that was meant to destroy me instead became a laboratory for innovation. For your empire building, prepare crisis transformation systems in advance. How will you gather intelligence when normal information sources fail? How will you make decisions when time is compressed and stakes are elevated? How will you maintain team cohesion when external pressure is maximized? How will you identify opportunities that only become visible during disruption? But crisis transformation also requires emotional resilience and psychological preparation. Crisis doesn't just challenge your strategies, it challenges your identity, your confidence, and your fundamental beliefs about what's possible. Empire builders develop the mental frameworks necessary to remain creative and opportunistic when others become reactive and defensive. Remember that your competitors are experiencing the same crisis pressures you are, but most of them will respond conventionally, cutting costs, reducing risks, waiting for stability to return. This creates opportunities for empire builders who can act boldly when others are paralyzed by uncertainty. The most powerful crisis transformations happen when you use the disruption to achieve changes that would have been impossible during stable times. Crisis creates urgency that overcomes resistance, opens minds that are normally closed, and makes people willing to try solutions they would normally reject. For your next 90 days, treat every setback as valuable information and every crisis as a hidden opportunity. Don't just survive the difficult moments. Use them to become stronger, smarter, and more capable than you were before they occurred. This is how empire builders turn their worst experiences into their greatest advantages. The crisis that breaks ordinary leaders forges extraordinary ones. The pressure that crushes weak systems creates opportunities for strong ones to expand into territory that becomes available during disruption. Napoleon's educational reforms and imperial university system, institutional frameworks that shaped minds and values across generations, creating influence that multiplied long after political power ended. True empire building creates influence that compounds across time, touching people and situations far removed from your direct involvement. I learned that the most enduring form of power comes not from commanding others, but from shaping how others think, what they value, and how they approach their own challenges. This influence multiplies exponentially as it passes from person to person. My establishment of the Imperial University system did more to extend French influence than any military campaign. By educating thousands of administrators, engineers, lawyers, and teachers, according to principles I established, I created a network of people who would carry those principles throughout Europe for generations. They became multipliers of my influence, applying my approaches to problems I never encountered in places I never visited. This is the difference between direct power and compound influence. Direct power requires your constant attention and energy to maintain. Compound influence becomes stronger over time as the people you've influenced begin influencing others, who influence still others, creating expanding networks of impact that continue growing without your involvement. Over your next 90 days, focus not just on what you can accomplish directly, but on how you can shape the thinking and capabilities of others in ways that will compound your influence far beyond what you could achieve alone. This means becoming someone whose ideas, methods, and principles become valuable enough that others want to adopt and extend them. Study how lasting influence has been created in your field. Who are the people whose ideas continue shaping how others approach problems decades after they introduce them? What made their concepts sticky enough to survive and spread? How did they embed their thinking into systems, practices, and cultures that perpetuate their influence? The key is creating value for others that becomes more valuable as it spreads. When I established merit-based advancement, I wasn't just improving my own administration. I was demonstrating a principle that others would adopt because it made their organizations more effective. The principle spread because it worked, not because I forced it on people. Your influence compounds when you solve problems that many people face, when you provide frameworks that others can adapt to their situations, when you demonstrate approaches that produce results others want to achieve. This requires thinking beyond your immediate objectives to consider how your methods and insights could benefit people in adjacent fields or future situations. I deliberately designed many of my reforms to be exportable, legal codes that could be adapted by other nations, administrative systems that could be scaled to different contexts, military innovations that could be learned and modified by other armies. I understood that ideas which help others succeed will naturally spread and multiply their impact. For your empire building, identify which of your capabilities, insights, or approaches could be valuable to others if properly shared and adapted. How can you package your knowledge in ways that others can implement successfully? How can you create systems that become more powerful as more people use them? But compound influence requires authentic value creation, not just clever marketing. People adopt and extend ideas that genuinely improve their results, their capabilities, or their understanding. If your influence is based on manipulation or temporary advantage, it will eventually be abandoned when people discover better alternatives. The most powerful compound influence comes from teaching others to achieve their own success using principles and methods they learned from you. When people succeed using your approaches, they become advocates for those approaches. When they teach others what they learned from you, your influence spreads without your direct involvement. Remember that compound influence often becomes more important than the original empire that created it. My political empire lasted roughly 15 years, but the influence of my legal, administrative, and educational innovations has lasted over 2 centuries and continues shaping how societies organize themselves. Create influence that serves others while advancing your objectives. Build systems that become more valuable as they spread. Develop approaches that others want to learn and apply. This transforms individual achievement into collective advancement and temporary success into enduring legacy. For your next 90 days, measure success not just by what you accomplish, but by how many others become more capable because of their interaction with you. Focus on creating value that multiplies as it spreads, solving problems that persist beyond your immediate situation, establishing principles that remain relevant as conditions change. The empire builder who creates compound influence doesn't just achieve personal success. They elevate entire industries, fields, or communities. Their individual accomplishments become launching platforms for others' success, creating networks of achievement that extend far beyond what any single person could accomplish alone. Napoleon's personal reflections from St. Helena, final insights on empire building, leadership, and the principles that create lasting achievement despite temporary setbacks. As I sit in exile on this remote island, watching the sun set over waters that separate me from the empire I built, I want to share with you the deepest truths I've learned about building something that matters. Distance from power provides clarity that proximity to power obscures. What I tell you now comes not from the height of victory, but from the wisdom of perspective. Empire building is not about the territory you control, but about the transformation you create in yourself, in others, and in the world around you. I conquered most of Europe, but my greatest conquest was conquering the limitations I was born with. I transformed myself from an obscure artillery officer into someone who could reshape the destiny of nations. This internal empire building must come before any external empire building. The principles I've shared with you over these past chapters, concentration of force, rapid execution, strategic positioning, psychological dominance, perfect timing, resource optimization, constant adaptation, momentum building, decisive command, systematic expansion, legacy systems, crisis transformation, and compound influence. These are not merely tactics for professional advancement. They are fundamental laws of how power actually works in the world. But here is what I want you to understand above all else. These principles are worthless unless you have the courage to apply them consistently when the stakes are real. Everyone can be strategic when the consequences are small. Empire builders remain strategic when everything is on the line. Everyone can be decisive about minor matters. Empire builders make life-changing decisions with incomplete information and full commitment. Your next 90 days will test not just your understanding of these principles, but your willingness to stake your future on them. There will be moments when following these teachings requires you to act contrary to popular opinion, conventional wisdom, and comfortable habits. Those moments are when real empire building begins. I've watched countless talented people fail, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked the conviction to persist when their approach was questioned, criticized, or initially unsuccessful. They had the knowledge to build empires, but not the determination to endure the inevitable resistance that empire building creates. Remember that every principle I've taught you will be tested by circumstances designed to make you abandon it. You will be tempted to scatter your focus when concentration feels risky. You will be pressured to slow down when speed feels dangerous. You will be encouraged to follow conventional paths when innovation feels uncertain. Your commitment to these principles during difficult moments determines whether you build an empire or just achieve temporary success. But also remember that empire building is ultimately about service, not self-aggrandizement. The empires that last are those that create value for others, that solve problems beyond their builders' immediate needs, that leave the world more capable and prosperous than they found it. My legal codes, educational systems, and administrative innovations outlasted my political power because they served needs larger than my personal ambitions. As you apply these principles over your next 90 days and beyond, constantly ask yourself, how does my empire building serve something greater than myself? How does my success create opportunities for others? How does my achievement contribute to progress that will continue long after I'm gone? The true measure of empire building is not the size of what you control, but the magnitude of what you enable. Not the territory you conquer, but the capabilities you develop. Not the power you accumulate, but the problems you solve. Not the recognition you receive, but the legacy you create. I conquered Europe, but Europe has moved beyond the need for conquerors. You have the opportunity to build empires that create rather than capture, that generate rather than extract, that elevate rather than dominate. Use the principles I've taught you to build something worthy of your potential and valuable to your world. Your 90-day empire-building journey begins with the decision to stop accepting limitations others have placed on what you can achieve. It continues with the daily application of proven principles regardless of immediate results or external opposition. It culminates in the creation of something larger, more valuable, and more enduring than what existed before you began. Remember, every empire begins with a single person who refuses to accept that things must remain as they are, who commits to creating something better, and who persists until vision becomes reality. That person could be you. Those 90 days could start today. Your empire awaits your decision to build it. Go now and build something worthy of the principles I have shared with you. Build something that matters. Build something that lasts. Build your empire.